Okay. Good evening, everyone. I hope I'm audible. Just flag it if I'm, if my voice gets cut in between. Thank you so much, firstly, for joining us today for this wonderful session on the occasion of the World Elephant Day. It is an honor to host these two amazing scientists who have literally spent their lives studying to me, the most amazing beings on this planet. I know I'm biased, but we will definitely hear more about them. But just before that, to give you an introduction, the Center for Wildlife Studies that I'm part of. So I'm Dr. Sreedhar Vijayakrishnan, and I'm a scientist with the Center for Wildlife Studies, and I currently head the Elephant Research and Conservation Program at CWS. The CWS is a research organization that had a long tradition of doing exemplary wildlife research and conservation across India, particularly with emphasis in the Western Ghats. And is also known for the pioneering tiger research that the founder and emeritus director, Dr. Ullas Karanth, has done over the past 37 years. And we at CWS, we used to do these series of seminars in person at our office in Bangalore. But thanks to the pandemic, it has been really difficult for us to do this in person. But we didn't, of course, give up, and we have started doing these online sessions called the CWS Wildlife Chronicles, which is a webinar series to discuss exciting topics in wildlife science and conservation. And over the past one and a half year, we have covered aspects ranging from tiger conservation, pandemic and One Health, wildlife conservation laws, the importance of sustainable tourism efforts, balance for communities and nature, elephant conservation, etc. And one of the things that we had in mind when we planned this webinar, particularly at the occasion of the World Elephant Day, was to not, in some sense, repeat what we have done in the past to talk about conservation conundrums or human-elephant conflict, and instead focus on something that's equally or rather more important, to study populations over long term. And when I started thinking about people, I had I quickly couldn't think about anyone else but Professor Lee and Dr. Fernando, whose work I have always admired and I've always looked up to. I've been fortunate to work very closely with Dr. Fernando, and I really hope that at some point I will also have the privilege to work with Professor Lee's team as well. So with that quick introduction, we will get into this right away. But before that, if you would like to support the work of CWS, you can use this code. Or if you have any queries regarding wildlife research, conservation, volunteering opportunities, or internship opportunities, you can write to us at outreach@cwsindia.org. So we're going to start the session right now. So just to introduce, before we get has a chair in psychology at the University of Stirling. She's got over 4 decades, about 45 years of experience working in the field of animal behavior. She's done exemplary work on a range of species, including baboons and the African elephants. But more importantly, she's also part of this probably the longest ever long-term elephant monitoring program across the world, Amboseli Elephant Research Project, started by Cynthia Moss, and she's been working with the Amboseli Elephant Research Project since 1982. Professor Lee has collaborated with a number of researchers working on the forest and the savanna elephants, and also on the Asian elephants and primates across the world. She's authored several books, edited volumes, journal publications, and book chapters. She, in addition to her interest in animal behavior, she also works with conservation attitudes, community conservation projects, and human-wildlife interactions. And so, warm welcome to you, Professor Lee. Once again, thank you so much for joining us today. And Dr. Fernando has been studying the Asian elephants for over 25 years in Sri Lanka. To start with, he's by basic training, he's a medical doctor, but he doesn't like to be addressed a medical doctor. But he instantly, started pursuing his interest in wildlife conservation soon after that. and did some amazing work at the University of Oregon and later at Columbia University. Prithu was one of those first scientists to actually look at genetic studies in free-ranging Asian elephants. Prithu is, to me, also has done most of his work on genetics and conservation and conflict mitigation. He's one person who has literally stirred my thoughts a lot when it comes to animal behavior. The kind of questions that he posed during my PhD period, being one of my PhD supervisors, literally made me think about elephant behavior, particularly in today's Anthropocene, from a completely different perspective. So I'm sure we will, and most importantly, of all of this, Prithu is also a wonderful wildlife artist. His wildlife drawings and paintings are par excellence, and the T-shirts and stickers that CCR has been putting out all have some of those amazing drawings, and he's even done some amazing exhibitions back in the 1990s in the US of his drawings. So once again, welcome to you, Prithu, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this session with us. So let's start. We'll just quickly get into the session. I guess let's just start with the most basic question. So, Professor Lee, how did you fall in love with elephants?
It's a really interesting question, because actually when I first started working in Tanzania many, many years ago, I was terrified of elephants. And I wasn't in love with them at all. I was terrified. And it wasn't until I'd spent some time with Cynthia Moss, watching the elephants in Amboseli, and actually getting to know mothers and babies, that I realized that these were the most amazing animals, and that they were not at all like primates, human or non-human. They were just wonderful. And that's when it started.
Yeah, that's quite amazing, and what an amazing landscape to have your first set of elephant sightings in Tanzania. And what about you, Prithu? How did you fall in love with these amazing beings?
Well, I guess I basically started working on elephants for my thesis, for my PhD, because elephants were big. And so, I mean, as Sri Lankans, I guess we are anyway very close to elephants as Indians are. And I guess so it's kind of just happened naturally. I don't know when.
Yeah, I guess it does happen naturally, particularly in a country like Sri Lanka. That's totally understandable. Yeah, but I guess the key is also holding on to that passion and continuing to do this amazing long-term work. So Professor Lee, just to get a sense, I mean, we were discussing about this before this webinar started, but to sort of for our participants to know about this, to start with, which are the landscapes that you have worked in, and what are some of the major challenges that you have faced in those areas?
Well, Amboseli is a very special environment, as you can see from the picture. It's one of the few places, it's a bit like Udawalawe, I think, that elephants are out in the open, and that the terrain is very easy to traverse for an elephant and for people in vehicles, which means you can do amazing observations of individuals, as they go along through their daily activities. But I tell you, working with forest elephants is a nightmare. Actually, watching elephants in any other part of Africa compared to Amboseli is a nightmare. They go behind bushes, they disappear, they make themselves the size of a tree trunk, and then they vanish. I don't know how they do it. And in the forest, you had to be so careful because they were not at all friendly, and you could smell them before you could see them. And that kind of detection, that kind of landscape, it's so difficult to work in. I have such admiration for everybody who works actually with any Indian elephants at all, because they're in such dense habitats, and we are so privileged to be able to see our animals. We're very lucky.
Yeah, I mean, I guess most of us can kind of relate with that, because I still remember when I was doing my PhD work, I worked 86 transects, of which I had elephant sightings only on 3 of them. So you can imagine how difficult it is to actually spot an elephant, particularly in deciduous and evergreen habitats.
Oh, and how dangerous it is as well. I mean, that's the thing we forget, is that it is very dangerous to be out there on foot looking for dung piles and running into elephants. It's terrifying, really, because they could just as easily, well, attack you. So we are very lucky. And I think that's one of the reasons our study has been able to go on for so long, is because we have been able to see the elephants in such great detail and so close up without the elephants being afraid of us and without us being afraid of them.
Right. So just over to you, Prithu. Could you just briefly talk about the landscapes that you have worked in, and what are some of the major challenges in those areas?
Yeah, so I mainly work in Sri Lanka, of course. And so we work in some of the protected areas such as Jala, Minneri, Kaudula. And so Minneri, Kaudula is, you see the elephants mostly on the open grasslands. I think Sreedhar has visited us there, where it's the grasslands are the reservoir beds when the water draws down. Become grasslands, and so it is kind of like the African savanna situation with short grass, extremely good visibility. But it's not a huge area. I mean, it's only about 10 square kilometers. But you do get a few hundred elephants coming there. In areas such as Jala, it's more scrub forest, and elephants are harder to see unless they come out into the open water holes, or open small patches of grass and places like that. But we also do a lot of work outside in protected area, because in Sri Lanka, 70% of elephant range is outside protected areas. So these elephants are much more difficult to observe and study, because they come into conflict with humans regularly. So they avoid humans. And also, as Prof. Lee mentioned, they can be quite aggressive towards humans.
Just as a follow-up question based on Sri Lanka and Asia at large to Prithu, see, despite their immense cultural relationship with people, or the cultural or mythological importance of elephants, particularly in countries like Sri Lanka, India, and so on, why do you think there is still a lot of gap in elephant research, particularly with regard to basic information such as their distribution? I mean, we have spoken about this at length earlier. But I think, it's also important to talk about this today. So why do you think there is this depth of information, or why there is this gap of research that has gone into basic information such as this?
It's Asia is a very complex situation. And so elephants are distributed across 13 range countries and over a fairly large area. But it is very complex, and things are different from place to place. And so, yeah, I mean, if you take distribution, I guess people know of local distributions. But as you know, it's only now that we are starting to look at even country distributions of elephants on a scientific basis.
Yeah. So the next question again is something that we just discussed, a couple of minutes before the webinar started. So let's talk about one of the most complex part of these long-term monitoring programs. Professor Lee, what have been some of the major challenges in establishing and running these long-term monitoring programs, especially in a country like Kenya, running the Zambosili Elephant Research Project?
Well, I think the main problem for any long-term study of any kind, whether you're a mongoose, a meerkat, a bird, insects, salamanders, or elephants, is funding. Really seriously, how do you have to keep long-term data collection going. Otherwise, you lose everything. You can't have a break. And what happens when your money runs out? How do you get more money? And that is such an important part of long-term studies, where you spend more of your time actually looking for funding than you do doing the research or writing up the research. And we've been very fortunate because 20 years or so ago, we went over to a model that was a trust, effectively. So we have been able to run the core project budget with donations from the public. And we have been very lucky to be supported because people do like elephants and they do support us. So that's a fabulous part of what we do. But we have also been lucky because we've had such wonderful research collaborators who've been able to get money from all kinds of NGOs and institutions and funding agencies, NSF and so on and so forth. And that's been very helpful. But none of all that's been for specific projects, you see, and that's the problem. You have funding for a project, but funding for your baseline monitoring is the hardest thing to do. And that's why we've used our model of funding for as a trust, which I think it does really help. I'd say one more thing. The other real problem we've had throughout this time is honestly keeping track of all the data and keeping it in some kind of format that's usable to somebody else other than the people that are actually collecting the data. So making it publicly accessible has also been a real challenge, and we're still working on that. So.
Yeah, I guess, I was in fact about to ask you about that because even with say 8 or 10-year-old data, we're still like, grappling to manage the data, make it in a format that is accessible to all. So I can't even imagine how a 45-year-old data set is being managed at the Amboseli Elephant Project.
This was a real problem when we were building our databases, because we would lose data that had been on different computer formats. You'd go away for 2 years and they'd stop using your mag tape, and you had to start all over again, re-entering data. And any of you who know what computers have been like over the last 50 years will know exactly what's happened, because we've gone from a pencil and paper age to a computer age.
Exactly. I mean, it kind of started when computers were like not even a possibility. So, I can only imagine how challenging it would have been, because I guess our generation is particularly privileged because the time we started collecting data, we had everything automated. We had computers readily accessible. So for us to have it all, stored in storage devices and hard disks and portable devices and all is so easy. But compared to what things would have been 45 years ago, where you're just, printing photographs and then marking your demographic parameters on the papers. And I can only think of how challenging it must have been.
It stays challenging now, because as you collect more data, the more data you get, the more challenging it becomes, because you have to have accessible formats for other people. You can't just have one Excel file, that doesn't work. So it's also very expensive to host those data. Mm-hmm. All of these things are, I'm sure, issues that everybody who works with long-term data has had to deal with. But we have a policy of keeping a paper copy of everything, and that's our insurance. Really, is the paper copy.
That's really wonderful. I guess that's that kind of ensures that even if your digital copies are gonna give issues at some point, you still have a backup that will be available. But I guess also when you start putting up a lot of these data on cloud, I can imagine how expensive it can really get, particularly to host such large data sets. So Prithu, how about at your end? What you've been studying elephants from the 90s since your PhD days, and then continued looking at demography and various other parameters in landscapes such as Yala. What have been some of the major challenges at your end, particularly with regard to raising funds, getting the permits, and so on?
Yes, Sreedhar, I mean, like Professor Lee mentioned, I couldn't agree more with about the issue of getting grants to keep going, because we are basically a non-governmental organization, and we are a very small organization, so we are on our own. It's not like we are a big institution. So yeah, the grants and funding is a major concern. But Sreedhar, also, I think, like we mentioned briefly before we started, I think another big problem we have in our countries, particularly in the Asian countries, is getting the approvals, permissions particularly to do work in protected areas, but also anything that involves interfering with the elephants. So, for example, radio collaring elephants, or sometimes even collecting elephant dung becomes an issue, and you have to get permission, and then that is a huge obstacle. Sometimes it shouldn't be, but so I feel that there is lack of appreciation of research in many parts of our part of the world. And also, in addition, I would add to that a lot of our research actually has very profound management implications. But and when you clearly can see how these findings should need to be incorporated in management for the better conservation of elephants, for better mitigation of human-elephant conflict. But it is very, very difficult to make that happen. So I think these are some of the challenges that we are faced with when we are working on conservation of elephants in this part of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I can totally relate to you with that, because, like you rightly said, perhaps this is largely a phenomenon with Asian countries. Even in India, it is really difficult, not just to raise funding to do these long-term monitoring programs, but also, more importantly, to get the departmental clearances to do these studies, even if it is within protected areas. Because in India, the Asian elephant is also a species that is protected under the Schedule 1 of the Wildlife Protection Act. So any studies, even outside protected areas on Asian elephants, really require wildlife department permits. So the permits take a lot of time to process often. So those have all been, and you know, very often you get permits only for like 2 years or 3 years, or at the max you might get it for 5 years. So if it's like a long-term study, I mean, I can't even imagine how doing a 45-year-old project would be, you know, how challenging that can get. But of course, we will we will come back to talking about working closely with governmental agencies in a bit. But before that, amidst talking about these various challenging situations, I just want to you know, lighten the conversation by asking both of you. So, Prithu, tell me something. You've got close to 3 decades of field experience working with elephants, and I'm sure that has gifted you with several memorable moments. And I've personally had some really good moments watching elephants with you in Yala and Ludagambera and Minaria and so on. Could you share one moment with elephants that has always remained etched in your memory?
Well, you mentioned this question before the thing, so, and I've been thinking about it. I'm afraid I can't point to any one particular incident. You know, I mean, the thing is, it's I think an amazing experience every single time you see elephants. So I think for me, I mean, there are situations where, you know, we have been in some physical danger. There are situations where we have seen elephants suffering, and all those are etched in your memory.
Yeah.
But I think every time you see these amazing animals in their natural environment, being elephants, you know, and behaving naturally, I think that is really amazing, and that is very rewarding. So I would say there's no one incident that I can relate, but every time that I see elephants, it is very special.
I mean, I agree more on that, because so I've had a, you know, I've had a long association with the species initially in captivity, because growing up in the southern Indian state of Kerala, which has a lot of association with elephants in captivity, I've had the opportunity or the privilege to actually grow up with elephants, listening to elephant tales. And despite all these years, you know, ever since I was a child, I've been watching elephants on a fairly regular basis in captivity and later on in wild. But even today, you know, every single sighting of an elephant is so exciting to me that it still seems like this is the first time I've ever seen an elephant. So I can completely relate to you when you say that. What about you, Professor Lee? If there is something, you know, if there's one particular moment that, you know, like Prithu said, every single sighting can be quite exciting, but for in your case, I guess most of our or at least some of our participants will know about Eco, the very famous elephant in Amboseli that Cynthia Moss has studied for such a long time. So and Amboseli memories have been written up, featured in various documentaries. So if there's something, one particular field tale that you want to share with our participants, what would that be?
Again, it's this overwhelming sense of privilege that you get from being able to watch a living elephant behaving. But for me, the thing that's been the most special has been watching the babies that I saw being born and observed in detail for almost 3 years, every minute of their day, grow up to be adults, have their own babies, to become musk bulls. This has been just a tremendously exciting phenomenon. I mean, it's like having your own children. One shouldn't say that, but it is like having your own children. And I had 350 of them, and I've got to watch them grow up. And I think that's been a unique and absolutely special thing that's happened to me.
Honestly, it actually gave me goosebumps when you say that. It's such a wonderful moment to watch these animals grow up, because I've been studying this population in the animals only for the past 8 or 9 years. Anand's been studying them for like 20 years now. And some of the elephants that were just born when Anand was doing his PhD became subadults when I started my master's work. Then later on dispersed from their group, became musk bulls. It is such a rewarding experience, I can tell you, and probably irreplaceable. Nothing else can match the excitement that this can perhaps give us. And that, I think, is one of the most crucial perks of these long-term monitoring programs, to literally watch these individual elephants grow up right in front of your eyes.
But of course, you have the suffering as well when they don't make it, and as you say, you watch many of them die as well, and that is heartbreaking then, because you've been invested in these animals as individuals, and
Exactly.
that is really sad.
Which I think is the most important thing, because and that is something that we have also been of late trying to emphasize on, because in all these years we have spoken about elephants as a population, or at a landscape level, or a country level, or a range level, but seldom do we acknowledge them as individuals. And in most of our work, that is something that we have always tried to emphasize on, to focus more on their individual idiosyncrasies, try and understand how complex, even at an individual level, their behaviors are, and how difficult it is even to sort of generalize any patterns for that matter. And what we see in landscape A may not necessarily be something that you would see in landscape B as well.
That's a really important point, I think, and that is one of the problems, is that there's so few long-term studies that we can't, extrapolate to every other population, like the Botswana elephants, or even the Sambur elephants, where they've been studying them for 20 years now. It's the same problem we have, but at least we know something more about the individuals.
Yeah, and yes, just coming back to your earlier point of how sometimes it can also be depressing, particularly in the African context, where poaching is still prevalent, legal hunting is still prevalent in certain parts. It can be quite disturbing, I'm sure. How much of that is actually a challenge in the populations that you have worked in?
For me,
Yeah.
we do get spearing. We do have a lack of coexistence. I try not to use the term conflict, actually, about human-elephant interactions, because that seems to me to be a political term about how we interact with the rest of the world. So what we're trying to do is work towards coexistence, as everyone here, I think, is arguing. But there are times when coexistence breaks down, and when elephants get speared, or when a real problem, of course, is that they go across borders and they go into other countries that have different regimes, and there they get hunted or they get poached. So there are, it is difficult. We do have still, not in Kenya, we're very lucky. We have very, very low poaching now. We have very effective management policies in place. But every place else, elephants are being threatened by people. They're being poached and they're being challenged and they're being speared and they're being shot as animals who people can't coexist with. So it is a real problem, I think, actually. Amboseli, when Cynthia Moss and Harvey started the project, the reason they chose it was because there had been very little hunting of the population in that area. So in many ways, it was one of the few populations that hadn't been poached or hunted to any large extent. And it's remained that way. We've been incredibly lucky. It's remained that way over the last almost 50 years. We're up to year 49 this September. So we are really getting there.
So talking about these, the spearing of elephants, the lack of coexistence at times, could you explain, talking about it from a larger perspective of poaching animals getting targeted due to spearing, or in retaliation or in defense in human elephant interface, could you explain your observations in this regard with regard to some of the behavioral and demographic changes that you have seen in the populations you have studied?
That's a very difficult question to answer simply and quickly.
I'm sure,
Basically, we have elephants who come into contact with people and with cattle. And if the cattle come too close, sheep and goats as well, come too close to the elephants when they're trying to get to water, or when they're surprised by livestock, or they're surprised by people, people on bicycles, or people walking through the bush collecting fuel wood or things like that. If elephants are surprised, they're often, I think the word's a little bit stupid, and they react very powerfully to livestock, and elephants will gore and kill livestock just like they'll gore and kill people. So that's one of the problems we have in our area, because it's still very much a pastoralist area. There's still a lot of pastoralist people and their livestock in the area. So, and elephants become very wary then of those individuals, the people that they know are dangerous to them. And they also become very grumpy with livestock. And I use grumpy in the sense of they become overly reactive to livestock. And then they get speared as a result. And that's where we see our problem at our interface. We also, remember, one of the things that's happening is that humans over time have become much more densely settled. And as a result, their tolerance for any animals in larger numbers, in numbers more than one, has become reduced. So we as people are getting less and less good at actually being used to animals. We've lost our capability to coexist with them to a large extent. We need to be sensitized to animals again.
Mm-hmm. So talking about coexistence, Prithu, I guess none of us would disagree upon the fact that Sri Lanka is one of the major conflict hotspots across the globe, be it Asian elephants or African elephants. So based on your long-term observations of elephants, poaching perhaps is not so much of a threat in a country like Sri Lanka, but when it comes to conflict, we are losing elephants at alarming rates. You have roughly about 250 to 300 elephants dying every year due to conflict. What are the conservation prospects of the species in the country at this current rate, according to you?
Yes, Sri Lanka has a very high level of human-elephant conflict. But then you have to look at it in the context of that elephants in Sri Lanka, in 70% of their range, are living in areas with resident people. So you are talking about a few thousand elephants coexisting with a few million people. So, this is, I think, a situation that is pretty much unique to Sri Lanka, the extent of it. So I think that is the root cause of the conflict. So, but the interesting thing is that the elephants also get adapted to conflict. And Fortunately, so basically the conflict is due to elephants raiding crops. So if you grow crops in an area with elephants, elephants are going to raid crops. But unfortunately, that continues to happen, and there is no way that it's going to stop or it's going to reverse. But another huge problem is that almost all traditional and I would say conventional methods of mitigation or prevention of crop raiding are confrontational. So elephants are the largest animals on land. And when you confront such an animal as a puny human and act with aggression towards that elephant, at some point, some elephants turn around. And when that happens, either you run away or you are dead. But when an elephant subject to harassment and conflict by people, aggression by people, turns around, and then he finds out, well, I actually can do this, and the people run away, or I can kill somebody, then you are creating a real problem animal. So unless we change these confrontational methods of crop protection, unless we go away from that, I think the problem will only increase.
So, talking about that, the confrontational techniques and so on, particularly in the context of conflict mitigation and going back to our larger topic today, long-term monitoring programs. See, it is also very important, be it conflict mitigation, be it conservation, be it long-term studies, to work very closely with governmental agencies such as the Wildlife Department. Fortunately or interestingly, some of my good friends from the Wildlife Department here are also actually attending this session. So how do you think the wildlife departments can actually contribute to such systematic long-term monitoring programs and systematic and planned conflict mitigation?
So I'll jump in here and say we have a wonderful partnership at the moment with the Kenya Wildlife Service, which is the land management organization for wildlands and wildlife in Kenya. I think if you don't have that good relationship with your wildlife partners, with the NGOs that are, or the government agencies that are managing the animals, I think it becomes very difficult because they're responsible for enforcement, for protection, for trying to build community relationships, for paying if there is crop damage. So all of these things a long-term project cannot do, and it must do in collaboration with its governmental hosts. And we work very closely with we're an active partner of our government with our government hosts. But we also work with a number of other NGOs that are, again, part of a larger community of monitoring groups that are specifically devoted to, for example, managing crop depredations or managing elephant movements into areas like musk bulls going around schools, that kind of thing. So there are other ways we can do this, but mostly we have to manage. I think we have to manage the elephant areas of use much more carefully, and long-term projects can't do that. We can inform, we're a collaborator, we're a partner in providing information, but we cannot actually do that ourselves.
Okay. What about your experiences, Prithu, from a country like Sri Lanka, where again the other challenging situation, particularly in Sri Lanka, is that the wildlife department and the forest department are two separate entities. So how challenging has it been to work closely with these governmental agencies, and how do you think they could also contribute to these monitoring programs? Oops, I think Prithu just dropped out. Okay, we'll just get back once he connects back. Just to continue with you, Professor Lee, the other question that I had for you is, how crucial has the contributions of local communities been in the execution of these monitoring exercises, and how do you think such programs benefit them back in the longer run?
Oh, very good question. Do they benefit them? they do now, at least in Kenya, because of the Conservancy movement, which is where local groups of landowners, for example, in our area, the pastoralist landowners, the Maasai, have got together and put land into an ecotourism and a grazing reservoir. So it serves multiple purposes. It has water, it grows crops, it grows a little bit of, not real crops, but grass crops. And it tolerates lots of wildlife. And so those community conservancies in Kenya have been incredibly important in protecting land. And that's the most important thing that can happen for elephants, is to protect land, open space, and to create open space that's allows use by humans and their non-destructive activities and wildlife. Because not just elephants, these environments have many other species in them that also need to be supported, as well as soils that need conservation for carbon sequestration and all the rest of it. So I think working with the communities is unbelievably important for us, but it's not always that easy. And we still like to think of ourselves in that context as bringing the elephant voice to the table. So when you have a stakeholder dialogue, when you're discussing what's going to happen in the future with land use, there's at least one voice that says the elephants need this to move, they need this to eat, they need this to have babies, and so on and so forth. So in order to be happy, we have to let their needs also be on the table with all the communities. But I think that's what we've tried to do. Whether we've been successful, we'll see in the future, but it is an ongoing problem, and it's an ongoing issue, and it requires constant negotiation, I think, with our communities.
So I guess, like Prithu was saying earlier, I think he had a bad network and he was unable to connect back. So one last question to you, Professor Lee, before we get into the questions that the participants have sent us. See, the Amboseli project is best known for its wide range of collaborations it has forged over the years and the resulting incredible research outputs from the work. From your experience, what are the most promising ways in which researchers, conservationists, policymakers, and the general public can come together to ensure sustainability of such monitoring programs, which are definitely need of the hour?
Fund us. Give us your money. I mean, seriously, that is the most important thing. The most important thing to keep a long-term project going is to get people to invest, to get the public to invest, and to tolerate and to appreciate elephants as what we like to think with a lot of the work on cognition, the work on empathy, the work on vocalizations, and the echoes, the films on echo, and all of that, the public outreach, is to appreciate elephants as sentient beings, which I know is not so much of a problem if you're working in an Asian context, but is much more of a problem in an African context. So I think that's what we've tried to contribute. So
right. So that's very important. I totally agree. Like we discussed earlier in this session, the greatest challenge for long-term monitoring programs is, of course, to secure long-term funding to ensure that the program runs smoothly and you don't have to grapple with the local logistics and so on. So I guess one way, is to identify important work such as these and contribute towards such programs. I'm just going to get into a few questions that Vinny has sent to me that are from the audience. The first one's, how does the rehabilitation of captive elephants or the orphaned elephants back to the wild work in Africa? Do they adapt really fast? We seldom see this in countries like India. Here we capture the so-called straying elephants, hence the question.
Oh, such an interesting question. I there is the orphanage in Sri Lanka that is having a successful release program into Udawalawe. So it's not entirely an African issue. And how successful has it been? Interesting question. We have very little monitoring. There's no scientific monitoring of it, but we do know that the elephants that survive the orphaning process and then stay alive until they're sort of age 6 to 8, and then go back to the wild, that they have had successful breeding from those. So they could be an effective population introduction mechanism, but it is a high cost. And I don't know if it's a high yield at this point. We don't actually have any monitoring to show that.
Mhm.
So it's incredibly difficult. These are orphaned animals. They're traumatized animals. They will carry the death of their mother or the death of their family with them for the rest of their lives. And that will affect them. That will affect their behavior throughout their life. And so I have to say we really do need more monitoring of it, but we just don't have it in place.
Right, yeah. There's another very interesting question to Professor Lee, which is about communities or instances where you have observed African elephants and people coexisting peacefully. I guess it's a little tricky to talk about peaceful or harmonious coexistence when it comes to large and potentially dangerous species such as elephants. But I'm sure you might have some examples to tell us about communities that are in some ways coexisting with elephants.
The pastoralist communities throughout Africa actually coexist very effectively with elephants. And that's partly because elephants and the pastoralists respect each other. They have knowledge of each other and they know how to behave around the elephants. They know not to frighten them. They know not to startle them or to come around behind a bush. And you can get people and elephants and livestock respecting each other's space because they know they're there, and then they can coexist quite effectively. And that's true across many of the pastoralist environments throughout Africa. I think actually farmers can coexist with elephants as well, as long as the farmers aren't put at risk of losing their lives or all of their income. And if you have an elephant that goes through your farm and just takes a little bit of cassava or a little bit of maize or a little bit of sugarcane, one can tolerate that. It's when they destroy your farm that it's actually a problem. So I think coexistence can be managed much better. I think we need to work with the people as well as the elephants.
So I'm going to step in here, in the place of Prithu and give some examples from Sri Lanka that I've had fortune to go visit. One of the things, just adding on to where Professor Lee ended, is that we need to really understand and acknowledge that human-elephant conflict is not really a wildlife problem, but more of a social problem, and needs management or solutions from people's perspective and not necessarily from the animals' perspective. And in terms of coexistence, I've seen some of the communities in Sri Lanka coexisting fairly well in deploying the village fences and the paddy field fences. So it fundamentally works based on the idea that you need to fence elephants out of habitations and not fence elephants within the forest. So you are that way also ensuring that there is free movement of elephants, but at the same time avoiding any kind of elephant movement towards or within habitations. So that has been a fairly good model that I've seen working fairly well in Sri Lanka. And then there are also other, we also have Anand attending this session, and Anand's efforts towards establishing the early warning systems in Valparai in southern India is yet another classical example of how coexistence can be promoted in a very challenging human wildlife interface landscape. By simple interventions such as informing people well in advance of elephant movement areas and so on. There's another very interesting question for you, Professor Lee, which is, what are some of the behavioral changes that you've seen in elephants today as compared to in the 80s when you started working? And how has the anthropogenic or human caused challenges made them to adapt and change their behavior in turn?
Interesting question again. My problem is that because we've been working with such well-habituated elephants in a very highly protected area, their behavior hasn't changed that much when we watch them. But what has changed is that because there has been more tolerance created in the surrounding area to elephants, and particularly conservancies have started, what we found is that elephants are much more willing to just go new places, to go away, to leave the central little tiny place where we started watching them and move out over 3,000 square kilometers. And that's a fantastic change in their behavior. They're more exploratory, they're more adventurous. And I think it's because they're more confident that they won't be harmed if they move around their ecosystem. So that's been a really positive change, and that's been as a result of the human coexistence with elephants on the basis of the communities. I think that's been really important as well.
Yeah, that's really important. In fact, we have been seeing some really interesting behavior, or rather adaptation, where elephants have now adapted well to live exclusively in human use landscapes within plantations and with very minimal damage to habitations or to crops and so on. So I think we are definitely seeing, so which is also the reason why I think it is important to understand elephants at an individual level rather than looking at them at a population level. There's a question to Prithu, which okay, this is about Asian elephants. What is the approximate home range of Asian elephants, and also please shed some light on elephant migration? So I'm just going to take this question, and the approximate home range is highly variable. It is very landscape specific. It also varies between males and females. Some of the earliest studies on free-ranging Asian elephants in India back in the 1980s actually showed that males range as wide as about 800 square kilometer, while herds actually ranged only about 120 to 200 square kilometers. But in the recent past, we have also had examples from central India where elephants have been found to range over an area of about 5,000 square kilometers, which is a little abnormal, but again, largely owing to elephants getting indiscriminately driven from habitations and perhaps losing orientation and so on. But at the same time, in the landscape where I've worked, the population that I've studied, the individuals that I've studied for my PhD, for instance, have had a home range that is anywhere between 40 to 100 square kilometer, not bigger than that. So I think it is highly dependent on the habitat, the disturbance levels, the resource availability, and various other factors. And I guess that is pretty much the same with the African elephants as well.
And I think your figures are very equivalent to ours. We have some elephants that range over very large areas and some that range over very small areas. For example, 30 square kilometers is their main home range. But then, of course, we have the exploratory ones, as you do, the males who go off exploring huge long distances away. And then we have local habitat specific or seasonal specific movements between very distant areas. So all of which, it depends on how you want to calculate your home range, of course, because if you have them move between two areas where they intensively use it, one here and then one here, they may have a very small range, but they move very large distances, over 60, 70, 100 kilometers. So that's very interesting, all of these. And forest elephants, again, we know far less about them, but the collared ones showed about that they could have huge home ranges, or very small ones as well, again, depending on the fruit availability in the forest. So it is so habitat specific. And it's also individuals, a matriarch who knows her way around, she will keep her group in the area she knows really well.
Yeah, I think that's also very key. It's also very individual specific, and perhaps also highly dependent on the past experiences of that particular individual in certain areas. The other question is, in Eastern Ghats landscape in southern India, there's more habitat fragmentation than the Western Ghats. People's behavior is also difficult. So, like, for example, so the larger question is, what is the probable solution in context where there are high deaths of both elephants and humans? I guess in a landscape like southern India, for instance, the way forward is to start with, for conflict mitigation, we need to understand that the blind replication of techniques that are found to be successful elsewhere may just lead to another failure. So we need to really understand what are the local conditions, what are the spatio-temporal patterns of conflict in particular areas, and devise sustainable mitigation measures accordingly. And there has to be, like Professor Lee mentioned, there has to be, the way forward is only coexistence. We need to really acknowledge that there's not going to be separate spaces for elephants and humans going forward, particularly at the current level of habitat fragmentation and habitat loss. So there has to be a lot more efforts towards making people aware and better prepared for living with wildlife, better timely ex gratia payment schemes, barriers such as fences put up around habitations, which do not obstruct elephant movement, but also prevents damages to houses and crop fields. So it has to be a multi-pronged approach rather than a one quick solution.
And I think it's creating that dynamic of a willingness to coexist. And that's the social problem. That's the sociology. That's why we have to work with people to create the willingness to coexist with elephants. And that to me is the most important thing that we need to do going forward. I mean, we can put up beehive fences till we're blue in the face, but they only work part of the time. They don't work all of the time. So we have to create the willingness for people to engage with elephants being in their area and to be sensitized to how to respond to them. And that really is the job of, I think, all the researchers on elephants.
Yeah, that's true. There's a very interesting question, which is also very relevant in today's context, which is the elephant reserves in India are on papers only, and they don't receive the legal status of the tiger reserves. And what are the policy decisions we should take to resolve this problem? One of the things, one of the ways forward is to work very closely with policymakers, which is also why in my last question to Professor Lee, I was saying that the long-term efforts towards understanding elephants, the long-term efforts towards mitigating conflict, all of this needs to be a collaborative effort between researchers, conservationists, policymakers, and the general public. And even for the tiger reserves to get a legal status, it literally didn't happen overnight. It took a lot of time for the tiger reserves to get the legal status that they enjoy today. So I guess we are all working towards that, and hopefully we have policy decisions being made. Now we are slowly having better protection for the elephant corridor. The Supreme Court, the apex judicial body of the country, has also been fairly supportive in terms of getting orders and notifications passed restricting any sort of construction, elephant corridors, and so on. So let's be hopeful, particularly on this World Elephant Day. I think we shouldn't be losing hope on our way forward. So let's be hopeful about that. There's a question. Sorry.
Can I just say, I think that at least what I know of what India is trying to do with corridors, and in particular with managing infrastructure, is one of the most important examples that you have to offer, and we need to that needs
similar, which is about whether we don't see a reduction crimes towards elephants or control of habitat loss.
Criminalize protecting humans, and I think we have to be very careful to make that clear, actually, really.
And I guess also perhaps it is not true that the stakeholders aren't giving it less enough priority. There perhaps needs to be a slightly different perspective level change in how we see human elephant conflict, how we try to understand the problem. And because unless one understands the problem more scientifically, blindly jumping into solutions is only going to be difficult. And controlling habitat loss and all is a larger policy level thing that we need to make. Yes, we need to do that, but at the same time there are certain conditions, or rather there are certain situations where your prioritizing development or infrastructural development can also not be jeopardized, particularly for a developing country like India. So there has to be a balance. I really wish Professor Dr. Fernando had continued on this call, because he would have been happy speaking about the managed elephant reserve that he had proposed to the government of Sri Lanka a few years back, wherein both developmental needs and the habitat needs of the species were also taken care of, and there was a balance. And in fact, there was a recent statement by a minister in Sri Lanka quoting Dr. Fernando's report, stating that the managed elephant reserve is something that we need to really make a reality by taking both developmental needs and the habitat requirements of the species into consideration.
I think, it's not just elephants we need to protect. We need to protect all the habitats for the future of biodiversity in general and for the future of the climate. So it is a bigger issue than just elephants. But at the same time, we can actually manage some of the infrastructure developments so that they're more appropriate for biodiversity, more appropriate for elephants, and allow the developments to go ahead sensitively in areas where it's kind of reasonable to do that kind of development. But that what we have to do is ask the question about land use, and that's a very difficult, very political problem, and often has too much money at the back of it to really be able for us biologists to solve that problem.
So I'm going to take one last question since we're almost out of time. And this one's to Professor Lee again. Given that there is a large-scale promotion of tourism in certain areas of African elephant landscapes, how do you think tourism is impacting elephant behavior?
Oh, what a great question. Tourism in many areas makes elephants more relaxed, because they appreciate that the tourists, if they're properly managed and don't have loud vehicles and they don't shout and smoke and do all those kinds of things, if tourism is properly managed, the elephants know that they're safe. So where you have tourism, you very seldom have an overlap with hunting. And that gives the animals a sense of security and safety and means they're more relaxed. The problem is that if you have a lot of illegal hunting and hunting in the same area where you have tourism, sometimes the elephants will respond to people aggressively and dangerously no matter what. That's the real problem, is that the elephants have to know that they're secure, and that's a cognitive ability that elephants have. They know if they're safe, and if they know if they're safe, they're great around tourists. And if tourists are present, they know they're safe. But if they've been translocated, or they've experienced orphaning, or they've been hunted, or they've been poached, even then tourism is not a great thing for them, because it's people. So probably.
The other major challenge for us, particularly in southern India, has been in the light of tourism, has been not just elephants, but baiting a range of species, including elephants, which eventually habituates them to human presence, makes them lose fear for humans. And eventually, when these animals get into cooperating, there is no way to deter them from the, from the croplands. And in turn, like how Prithu mentioned earlier, you're literally creating a problem animal.
I mean, tourism itself is not terribly well managed in many areas, and I've seen the pictures of thousands of people stopping their little jeeps to look at a musk bull, and him being very upset about it and charging someone. So again, it's a question of management of the people. It's not the elephant that needs to be managed in that tourism context. Is that the people need to be managed, and so you don't want to bait them, you don't want to surround them, you don't want to have more than one vehicle at a time, or two vehicles or something like that at a time in any one spot, because that's what causes the problems, and that's what causes negative consequences even of tourism. So again, it's something that has to be managed, and as long as there's a financial benefit from baiting elephants, people will do it. We're like that, we're humans.
Yeah. That's true. Okay, I think with that we'll probably wrap up the session, because I've already taken more than an hour's time from Professor Lee. Unfortunately, Dr. Fernando's call got disconnected in between. He had already given us a disclaimer that because of a network outage, he was trying to connect from field. But I'm really glad that he was here to answer some of the pertinent questions that I had targeted towards him. This has been such a wonderful session. Before I thank Professor Lee and Dr. Fernando, thanks to all the participants who logged in on time and stayed till the end of this session. I can literally see the numbers not changing much right from the beginning of the session till the end. So once again, thanks so much, Professor Lee, for agreeing to do this session at such short notice. I literally wrote to you like 3-4 days ago, and you readily, in a couple of hours, you wrote back to me that you will be more than happy to do this. It is such a wonderful experience for us to hear from your close to 5 decades of experience working working in the field of animal behavior, particularly with such amazing beings such as the elephants. And I really hope that the current pandemic is you get to feel soon, and that at least some of us get the opportunity to join you on field and learn more about and perhaps get to work closely as well. So once again, on both on behalf of Center for Wildlife Studies and at my individual capacity, thank you so much, Professor Lee, for joining us and sharing such remarkable experience from your long exemplary career studying these magnificent beings. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. It has been a real privilege to talk to everybody here today and to meet you. And I'm so, what a wonderful Elephant Day, World Elephant Day. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And once again, a wonderful Elephant Day wishes both to Professor Lee, Dr. Fernando, and all the participants. And let's, as I mentioned earlier, at least on this World Elephant Day, let's close on a positive note that we will be able to secure the future for these incredible beings going forward. We will all join hands and work towards securing the future of this amazing species. Thank you, everyone.